Posting on social media, the American president threatened that there could soon be nothing left of the country if negotiations to end the war fail. But while the rhetoric is dramatic, it's also familiar. President Trump has repeatedly issued escalating deadlines and grandiose threats throughout this conflict, only to walk them back or take no action, often while behind-the-scenes diplomacy continues. Well, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghea confirmed that Tehran had received what he called corrective considerations from the United States through Pakistani mediators, and that Iran has now sent its response to Washington. Mr. Baghea also defended his country's efforts to establish new mechanisms to govern transit through the Strait of Hormuz, saying Tehran and Oman had a legal and logical basis for managing safe passage through the vital waterway. And he warned that Iran was prepared to respond to what he called even the smallest mistake from the opposing side. Cameron Matin is Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex in the UK. Welcome back to DW. So the clock is ticking, and the US president is warning that there could soon be nothing left of Iran. How does Tehran view these overblown threats from Donald Trump, which he's used before without following through? Are they seen as credible?
Well, by now you would imagine that Iranians, like most people following Trump on through social, be very familiar with these threats. And at least since the ceasefire, many of these threats have been made without being implemented. And it could be equally just a matter of Trump's strategy of putting more pressure on Iran in order to reach a deal. And behind the scenes, messages being exchanged, even though Trump flatly rejected Iran's response to its own proposal. We hear that, in fact, Iran has sent US a new set of, a revised version of the original proposal in response to US feedback on its own proposal for peace. So there seems to be communication going on. Whether it leads to a deal, it's difficult to know, because from what we hear, the gap remains quite wide between the two sides. So the possibility of resumption of war is actually quite possible, as much as a deal might be on the cards as well.
And that gap, is it as simple as control of the Strait of Hormuz and whether Iran should be allowed to have nuclear weapons? Is that what it boils down to?
Well, actually, I think it's more than that, because Iran has always denied that it wants to build a nuclear weapon, and they have repeated it again. The issue is really enrichment, which Iran insists it has the right to as a signatory of NPT. The American side, if we take Marco Rubio's statement a few weeks ago, is that, well, we really don't care about Iran having an in principle or abstract right of enrichment. What we are interested in is practical non-enrichment. And that's something which Iran seems to be rejecting, because it would require demolishing of its nuclear facilities, enrichment facilities, and so on, which they have been refusing in the past, and they are currently also refusing. So we have to really see how they can find a formula which both sides can accept. We heard from Trump on the way back from China that US can live with a 20-year suspension of enrichment, so a long period without completely removing the possibility of enrichment in the future. Whether Iran, accepts such a long period of non-enrichment, we have to see. In the past, they have rejected it, but it leaves space for negotiations in terms of the possible, the length of such a period. But also there are issues such as Iran demands actually war damages, indemnities, and so on, which US has rejected, but instead has apparently suggested creating a so-called reconstruction and development fund, something similar to what happened after Second World War to redevelop Europe. But where the funds come from into this new fund, we don't really know. And so Iran seems to be quite suspicious about this general kind of commitments without any substance offered by the Americans.
All right, let's talk more about the Strait of Hormuz. the tolls from which Iran hopes to use for reconstruction. One of the most interesting developments is that Iran has now created this, or is talking about these new mechanisms to govern traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, do you think Iran is serious about that as the way forward, the way it wishes the world to be from this point on? Or is that just Iran leveraging its best card really hard?
I mean, one could make an argument for both actually options, because Iran apparently has insisted on the recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz from the Americans, something which Americans obviously have refused. But here we're also dealing not just with Iran or the US, but also other Arab states which have basically shores on the Persian Gulf, including UAE, which is much more hawkish on Iran and on the terms of any peace to be made with Iran, but also Saudi Arabia and others whose economy really depends on the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it is conceivable that Iran might relent on this particular issue to some extent in order to get concessions in relation to both the nuclear file, but also Iran's blocked assets, and also the massive sanctions which is on the Iranian economy, has been on the Iranian economy for decades really now. And especially I think the sanctions and the blocked assets are really crucial for Iran if the Islamic Republic, seeks to survive the peace as opposed to the war, because, it is possible that, let's assume the war somehow ends, but Iran has to deal with a destroyed economy, with millions of people having lost their jobs, and all the problems which had given rise to multiple popular unrests, which the regime was able to put down only by killing thousands of protesters. So in order to avoid that, or at least reduce the chance of it, it has to have economic resources and financial resources to rebuild the country, which is why they are insisting on this particular demand from the US.
Moving on, we've also seen renewed drone incidents affecting Gulf states, including the UAE, as you mentioned. So is this a widening regional conflict despite this ceasefire technically still being in place? Or is this just the way these things are done? We call it a ceasefire, it's a bit ragged, but if we both agree that it's kind of okay, then we'll live with it.
I think to some extent that's the case. I mean, we don't really know who has launched these drones. Iranians seem to deny it. And like to point to Israel as, doing some sort of false flag operation. But it could also be, quite possible Iran wants to remind everyone that if the war resumes, there are soft targets, including UAE infrastructure and so on. And let's remember that UAE actually received the bulk of Iran's missiles during the actual war, even more than Israel. So I'm not surprised if it turns out that it was Iran and is trying to basically threaten them with what might come if the full war resumes. But there are other really interesting things also happening, such as reports of Pakistan deploying a squadron of its fighter jets, 8,000 troops, many drones, and basically a lot of military muscle on Saudi Arabian soil, which as part of its mutual defense pact, which they concluded last year. This gives Pakistan a very strange situation, position of being mediator as well as, indirect party to the war as an ally of the Saudi Arabia. So things are shaping up, and I think that particular development must give Iranians some food for thought, because during this ceasefire, we see that a sort of alliance is shaping up between Arab states indirectly with Israel, but also actualization of the defense pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So if the war resumes, it may not be just US, Israel, and Iran, but others involved. And there were reports of actually Saudis and UAE airplanes having bombed Iran during the actual war before ceasefire. Right. So Iran would face more military pressure.
So let's look a little closer at that. As you say, Pakistan has made this huge deployment under the aegis of this mutual defence pact that it has with Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia has held off on invoking, apparently, until now. So why would Saudi Arabia do this now? And how does Pakistan's about to be direct involvement in this conflict affect its role as a supposedly independent and neutral mediator?
I mean, all of this actually could be, you know, a textbook example of brinkmanship, i.e., you use particular instruments to force the other side to concede, but once in place, those actions you have taken in order to actually prevent, in this case, resumption of war, might actually lead to war, or at least intensification of it.
Forgive me for interrupting. Let me just interrupt just there, because I can't, sure. I know it's a complicated issue, but I can't quite work out who in that scenario you've painted there is putting the pressure on whom, for what purpose. This is Pakistan being drawn into this. Are you saying that this is Saudi Arabia trying to pressure Pakistan?
Yeah, no, I mean Saudi Arabia and Pakistan jointly trying to pressure Iran at the very same time that US also pressures Iran, because Pakistan does not really like to be dragged into the war. However, it has this pact with Saudi Arabia, in return for which it receives billions of dollars of aid and all sorts of assistance from Saudi Arabia. So it cannot simply not act upon that defense pact. Right. So Pakistan has an interest in war not resuming, but it also cannot really lose Saudi Arabia as a major patron. So they are hoping that this kind of movement will give Iran more incentive to actually be more flexible in its discussions with the US, so that the war is not resumed. But those very movements might, make a tense situation even more tense, and Iranians might read that as part of a larger, a mobilization against them in order to, to make a new round of war even more destructive as far as Iran is concerned.
Okay, thank you for talking us so clearly through that complicated situation, which is getting even more tangled. Kamran Matin from the University of Sussex. Thank you. Bye-bye.